In this video we're going to do the material for the ninja's face, which has a little bit of subsurface scattering in it. Now I'm sure you probably know what subsurface scattering is already, but let me just show you in case. And I've got a sphere here which has just been subdivided a little bit, and a sun lamp with a ground plane and a little bit of light coming from the environment. So that's kind of what the render looks like. I've got a subsurface scattering shader here, all on the default settings, and then I've switched to branch path tracing just to get it a little bit less noisy on the first few samples so we can see what it's doing. Now as you can see, we've got a regular color value over here that we can change just like a diffuse shader, and then a normal input like every other shader as well. But of course, because this is subsurface scattering, we've got some more controls over the fall off and the scale and the radius and the sharpness and texture blur. Now the fall off is basically the shape of the sort of the difference between the light and dark areas and how it slowly fades off between them. I suggest you stick with the default cubic unless you know specifically that you want Gaussian. Now the scale is probably quite intuitive. If we put it on 0, the scale of our subsurface scattering is going to be pretty much the same as a diffuse surface. If we increase this a little bit, you can see this edge is getting a bit softer and some more light is getting around the back. If we increase this a little bit more, you can see that gets spread a bit further. It sort of feels like it's getting blurred a bit. And of course, if we put this all the way on 1, which is the same as the radius as this of the sphere, you can see that this is a really soft edge and it feels a little bit strange. So let's just put this on 0.3 for now. Now the radius setting over here is basically a vector where this is the red, green, and blue colors, and we get to control what the radius of each of these 3 channels are. So if I just put this back on white with 0 saturation, you can see that the material itself is completely white at the moment. But if I change the radius, maybe make the green channel 0.7 and the blue one 0.5, you can see that although it seems to be mostly white, there's some color in the edge over here. And that's quite an important thing that we want to do with skin, because the color bleeds off at different rates depending on the material and the deepness of the surface. So if we make this back as a skin color, you can see it looks quite, it looks more like skin. Now the sharpness and texture blur we're not really going to worry about because the face is sort of quite a small area and it doesn't make too much of obvious difference, so we're just going to ignore that for now. It's quite easy to understand. The texture blur literally blurs the texture on your model, and that helps to make it feel a little bit more soft, and then the sharpness helps to make sharp edges like the corner of a cube look a little bit more sharp and not quite so soft and subsurface scattery. So that's basically what subsurface scattering is. So let's go back to our ninja over here and do the same thing. We'll add some nodes, swap this to a subsurface scattering shader. And of course you can see it says subsurface scattering is not supported on GPU rendering, so we need to go and switch this to CPU. Now I'm sure sometime in the future it will be, but at the moment, Blender 2.71, it's not quite ready yet. It works for some cards, but not all GPUs, so they're just keeping it disabled for now. So let's go and hit Shift Z, and you can see the default scale of 1 is way too big. It's sort of feels like this weird translucent surface. Doesn't really make sense, but of course, if we put this on 0, it's just a regular diffuse shader. So let's try and put this on 0.1 and see if that works. It's much better, but this is still a little bit too soft, I think. So let's try something about 0.03. And I think that's much better. You can see it's definitely got some soft edge over here, but it's not overdone. It doesn't look like wax. A lot of people tend to overdo the scale of subsurface scattering, and it looks like a terrible wax sculpture. So we're going to change this again to 0.7 and 0.5, and that's just going to give us a nicer fall off on the colors on the edges here. Now I'm going to change it to branch path tracing again, and the subsurface samples on 4, and you can see it just renders a little bit cleaner, a little bit quicker. Okay, and I think that's pretty much it for our subsurface color. But now what we want to do is plug a texture into the color over here. So let's go ahead and add our image texture, and this is going to be face diffuse.png, which will go straight in there. and that looks pretty good. But now of course skin isn't just a single subsurface scattering shader, we need to add a little bit of reflections as well. So let's go and add our glossy shader, mix these two together, and you can see that that's working quite well. You might have noticed that by default Blender now uses the GGX distribution, and that was mostly for, or by default rather, and that's mostly for performance reasons, but for skin GGX is actually a little bit nicer for skin, so leave it at that. Beckman is usually best for metals and sometimes different kinds of plastic. It just depends on the material you want. Okay, so we want to go ahead and add our specular map now, which we'll use on this mix shader back over here. So let's duplicate our image texture and go and find the face spec. But now you notice this is really white over here and really black around the eyes. So if we plug this in immediately, it's going to look really weird, like he's got some kind of metal on his forehead. Pretty cool, but pretty weird. So what we're going to do is we're going to mix it together with the original color texture and just leave it on mix and leave it on 0.5, and that's cool. But this is still a little bit too much for our purposes. And whoops, let's go and plug that into our color. There we go. So what we're going to do is, first of all, add 0.1 to this. There we go. And what that's going to do is just fill in these dark areas here. If we didn't do that, it would make it a little bit too dark. So we add it there, and then what we're going to do is multiply it just to reduce the amount, just to reduce its effect. So if we change this to multiply, leave it on 0.1, you can see it's much darker. And just in case, as a habit, let's clamp it, just to be sure we're not doing anything we don't want. And plug that guy into the FAC, and that looks quite a lot better. Finally, let's just do a bump map quickly, and we'll do that by taking the image texture and plugging it into the final output, or the displacement of the final output anyway. But of course, as you can see, this is really weird. The bump map is obviously too strong, so we just need to add a math node, change it to multiply, and reduce this to maybe 0.1. Subsurface scattering does generally make the bump mapping less obvious. It's harder to see, it smooths it out quite a bit, but if you want to make sure that what you're doing is sort of doing something, you can always go ahead and add a diffuse texture and plug this guy into there, and then you can see what the bump map is actually doing, as you can see up here. Now, doing that, I can see that these little speckles over here are kind of pointing outwards, and it would feel a little bit more natural, I think, if they were pointing inwards rather. So let's just change this to negative 0.1, and that's working just fine. Okay, so that is our final material done for the skin. So in the next video, we're going to go and do some metals, which I think are pretty cool.